I think in many ways we come to the place where Glasgow started, where it all found its origins, its rootedness, or even its genesis. We come here to the tomb of St Mungo for this, a little bit of a journey around Glasgow Cathedral and some of the motifs within the cathedral. What we must always remember is that although we have these beautiful things, the cathedral in and of itself is a place wherein the good news is proclaimed. And the good news speaks about feeding the hungry, clothing the naked, sheltering the homeless, and in many ways binding up the brokenhearted. So please always hold that in your mind as you look at the beautiful things that are in this place, as you look at the motifs and the symbols and the signage and the art that has clearly given voice to the good news and the gospel. I think in many ways I'm humbled when I come into the cathedral because I do see it as a place of beginnings for the city, but I equally see it as a place of challenge. Because sometimes we can get distracted by the many beautiful things. And I'm often brought up short when I read again Norman MacCaig's poem about Assisi. So before we begin this journey around this 12th century cathedral, let me read to you the words of Norman MacCaig. He said, "The dwarf with his hands on backwards sat slumped like a half-filled sack on tiny twisted legs from which sawdust might run. Outside the 3 tiers of churches, built in honour of St Francis, brother of the poor talker with birds, over whom he had the privilege of not yet being dead." A priest explained how clever it was for Giotto to make his frescoes tell stories that would reveal the illustration, the goodness of God and the suffering of his Son. I understood the explanation and the cleverness. A rush of tourists clucking contentedly fluttered after him as he scattered the grain of the word. It was they who passed the ruined temple outside, whose eyes wept pus, whose back was higher than his head, whose lopsided mouth said gratia in a voice as sweet as a child when she speaks to her mother, or a bird when it spoke to St Francis. So today, let's enjoy the walk around the cathedral, but let's remember its core purpose and meaning. I make this journey not alone, but with a friend and colleague, Gordon, and he knows way more about this space and place than I do. So Gordon, will we start our walk around the cathedral here in Glasgow?
That would be great.
Let's wander. Gordon, one of the things that strikes me as I wonder about the cathedral is the significance of some of the windows with respect to important things within the life of the city. And one of the windows that I often stop at because of its detail is the window that looks towards the trades of Glasgow. Now tell me, the trades have got a significance in the life of the cathedral and how it managed to continue in a way that maybe other cathedrals didn't. Tell me a wee bit about that.
Well, that is a fascinating thing, not just for Glasgow, but for the history of the church and for the country. People tend to associate the starker types of Calvinist doctrine with John Knox, but in actual fact it was his real successor, Andrew Melville, that began the real iconoclasm. There was rioting and destruction in Knoxian times, but Andrew Melville really had it in for it. And one of the things that happened then was in 1579, a commission under the Earls of Argyll and Glencairn was sent to Glasgow to take the roof off, or at least to take the lead off the cathedral roof. Now, the incorporations in Glasgow had been responsible for making the building, or at least so they claimed. The incorporations of Masons and Wrights claimed to date back to 1057, when King Malcolm III supposedly granted them a charter to protect those who were working on the cathedral. So, of course, they were outraged at the thought of anything happening to this building that they regarded as their own special interest. Dinna ding doon our church. Right. And so the people of Glasgow turned out here and they prevented any work being done. And to this day, this is remembered among the incorporated trades, especially the Wrights and Masons and Coopers, who all claim to date back to that charter.
Do you know, it's Malcolm. A lovely story, because I think it's that blend of almost like theology and kind of social need, because I'm always aware that when they speak about maybe taking the roof off, I'm sure there were some theological reasons, but I'm sure some folk fancied some of that timber for their own house, and some of that stone for their own house, and some of that lead to perhaps sell. So although I think there's clearly a theology I think there was also a bit of a kind of practical purpose.
Oh, I think everything in the Middle Ages, even nowadays, there's some kind of practical purpose. And when part of the roof in this building was renovated about 1900, bits that were still usable were sold off and made into trinkets and ornaments.
Do you know, Gordon, it's funny, and maybe at one point we can look at it, but in the sacristy today, there is a sideboard, a rather hefty sideboard, which has a little plaque telling us that it was made from the timbers that, as you say, were preserved after the roof was being redone. But Gordon, we come to this part in the church, which is in the choir area towards the east end of the sanctuary. And in front of us today is really a window that helps us look towards all of these trades and the guilds. But tell me, because I know there's maybe even a priority in terms of the most significant, and I don't want to suggest least significant, but, the order of precedence is maybe what we would look at. So is there a significance in the window and the imagery within the window? And could you tell us a bit about that?
Well, yes. As I mentioned earlier, there's a tradition among some of the incorporated trades that they date back to 1057, but the actual order was fixed in terms of a decree of the Court of Session in the 18th century, initiated by the incorporation of hammermen, and I believe that they have the court decree still in their records, and that fixed the order, which is reflected in the coats of arms depicted in the glass. Up at the top, and it's a particularly useful window for doing this, because up at the top we have the trades house itself, and then in the appropriate order, the hammermen and the tailors, the cordoners and the maltmen and the weavers, and so on, all the way down to the incorporation of bonnet makers and dyers, which is the most recent one to be incorporated. Then the first ones bear nothing to do with the dates when they became corporate bodies, only the latter ones.
I see. And when you look at some of the symbols within the particular, motifs, can you bring out some of the symbols that are maybe in the one at the very top, which is the Trades House of Glasgow? I see the corn there, and I see the fish and the bell and the tree and any other motifs that you would bring to our attention?
Well, I'm so interested that you refer to as corn minister. Because that's what most people think when they first see it.
Is it arrows?
It's arrows.
Oh, do you know? Well done.
It's 14 arrows bound together in a sheaf, and that reflects the motto common to most of the incorporated trades bodies throughout Europe, on the grounds that unity makes strength. So in Glasgow it is union makes strength, and that is the body, that's the motto of the trades house itself.
I see.
But most of these symbols have connections all across the country, and in some cases all across Europe. And a good one to look at, because it stands out there, is the incorporation of weavers with the leopards' heads and the shuttles, which really is based upon the Worshipful Company of Weavers of London.
I can see the cats. I can see the cats' heads. But where are the shuttles?
Well, they're grasped firmly in their mouths.
Ah, right, okay. So from this distance, right, now that you point that out, I do see it.
Yes, but you can also see it in the chevron in the middle, and I'm not quite certain what these are, but in the London crafts, I think these would be roses, and I suspect here they might be thistles.
Do you know, Gordon, I think they are thistles. When I'm looking at them, you've got the purple of the thistle with the green leaves round about it. And then if we moved along, any other one that you would be particularly familiar with, that you could draw out some of the symbols that are within it?
Well, I think two that I think would be particularly interesting here are, first of all, the skinners, because they are the earliest ones, and that's that one on the left-hand lancet with the caps of maintenance and the veer and the stags, showing the importance of the materials that the skinners and glovers had to deal with. And then next to that we have the rights, and I think the rights are particularly interesting because of the way in which their arms are depicted. At the top there are the emblems of actual work that people the tools that people would use to do the work of the rights, and then there is a masoned wall And underneath that is, believe it or not, the upper part of St Mungo.
Yes, I do see. And I noticed that the kind of, again, the motifs of the tools on either side of the lancet, that may just be for, you know, in a sense, decorative purposes to fill the space, but you can see how they've pulled those motifs out again. Yes. But no, you can see it looks like a kind of an axe and a hammer and a chisel that all seem to be kind of present there. Very, very good. And then if we kind of come down to the barbers, I see what look like open razors, and they look rather lethal if you look at these ones on the top.
Well, they are indeed, and that is exactly what they are. But those perhaps, well, yes, these are shaving razors, but the ones in the chevron are bleeding razors of the sort that you would stick in your arm.
For medical purposes?
For medical purposes in the medieval period, and indeed more recently. And that all goes back to 1599, which is when the incorporation of Barbers and Surgeons of Glasgow got its charter from King James VI. Now, they are tied up in some manner way with the granting of the Royal Charter to the Physicians and Surgeons of Glasgow by King James VI.
Yes, right, under Peter Lowe.
Under Master Peter Lowe, whose remains and monument lie outside here.
They do, and every year we would have the service for the Royal College, and we would visit their premises with the Prince Charlotte Suite, and they've got a lovely modest museum now as well.
Well, that's I've not seen that.
Very good.
In the 18th century there was a dispute between the barbers and the surgeons. And the magistrates of Glasgow decided that the barbers were the people to be part of the civic life of Glasgow, and they were allowed to elect a deacon.
That's interesting. It is interesting with the Royal College, because, you know, on their annual visit, it gives me an opportunity to look again. And I think what has struck me again and again, sort of Master Peter, or Maester Peter, as some of the documents say, they have that sense in which it was about standards. It was about his awareness that the kind of surgical medical standards across Europe, in a sense, needed to have some kind of regulation, and then coming to Scotland to create that opportunity to bring a standardisation which would, in a sense, raise the quality of the service that was offered to those in need. So, no, Maester Peter really does come to the fore, but I'm intrigued by the fact that the barbers became part of civic life in a way that maybe the physicians and surgeons didn't. But, you know, a wonderful window, Gordon, a wonderful window to look at. And I think one of the other things that intrigues us about this window here is you'll notice it's a 4-lancet window, whereas the one to the right's a 2.5 and the one to the left is a 3-lancet window. And there's some discussion and debate as to why do we have a 4-lancet window at this point in the cathedral?
Well,
and
I don't know how true this is, and you might be able to correct me.
Tell me your story, because I think I may not correct it, because I may like to indulge myself in such mythology.
Well, I think that had been left as the main opening through which materials were brought into the church for its construction, and when that had all been done, in order to keep the measurements of the lancets more or less the same throughout, 4 were constructed there instead of 3.
I think that's a fairly worthy story. I think there is also a sense in which some folk feel as though there may have been a significant altar of some sort in this area, and it would have been an area where greater light would have come in, because it's facing the south and would have got light for most of the day. But I kind of like both stories, so I kind of, you pay your money and take your choice, as I think you do with many of the emblems, motifs, symbols and pieces of art that are in the cathedral. But thanks for looking at this window. Come on, we'll take a wander and we'll look at some other bits and pieces.
Yeah, delighted.
Gordon, we've wandered just a little further east on this, I suppose, what is the south ambularium in the choir of the cathedral. And we move down from the trades window and we come to another window which refers clearly to another body that had significance in the life of the city. So if we have the trades and we have the merchants, tell me how that worked in terms of the significance for and in the city.
Well, as you know, of course, Glasgow started out as an episcopal barony under the sovereignty and suzerainty and superiority of the bishop, later the Archbishop of Glasgow. And the bishops and archbishops granted charters of incorporation, known as seals of cause, to various groups of traders, all of them, in fact, members of the craftsman order, but the merchants didn't have an organisation of their own, although they were more powerful, or they thought that they ought to be. And because Glasgow was not a royal borough, it wasn't necessary for the majority of the council to be made up of merchants, which was the case in royal boroughs under statute. And the Glasgow merchants thought they ought to be treated in the same way, because although Glasgow was not a royal borough, it was very significant, and it was allowed to be treated as if it were a royal borough. So towards the end of the 16th century, Glasgow, following, I have to say, in the footsteps of Edinburgh, the merchants and the craftsmen submitted the matter to arbitration by King James VI. And on the 6th of February 1605, King James replied and granted what was called the Letter of Gildry, that laid down Glasgow's constitution for the next 3.5 centuries, and the merchants were given the prime place under that.
Right, so you ended up not quite with a hierarchy, but a kind of pecking order.
Oh, certainly
in
a
the life
pecking
of the
order,
city.
and indeed a hierarchy, because the merchants were always to be a majority on the council, and the provost was always to be the Lord Dean of Guild that led the merchants' body, and the craftsmen were to be led by the Deacon Convener of the Trades.
That's interesting, because I know that symbolically still these bodies would have seats on the council, often non-voting seats, but they would still be able to be present at council, and I think very much become part of the civic life of what's happening in the city. So tell me, we look at this window, which again is on the south side, so lots of light would come through this window, and I suppose there are a few motifs I would pick out. We would, being in the Church of Scotland and a Church of Scotland minister, the motif of Neg Tamen Consumi Batur, the image of the burning bush, the allusion to the bush not being consumed. And there's lots of references there. One is about Moses and Moses finding the bush, and the bush is not consumed, and it speaks of God's holy presence. There's also the reference and allusion to the fact that even during the disruption, the church was not consumed. The church in itself still managed to flourish and survive. But that's a motif in the bottom sort of segment of this middle lancet here. And then above we have the image of Mungo, and within that there's the other motifs that tie in. We've got the bird at the bottom, and we'll maybe speak about that in terms of the carpet imagery that we have behind us. Mungo image. But the two that I suppose I would want to kind of maybe sort of pick your brain on, one would be the fact that there's this rather resplendent image of a ship in full sail atop a globe, with a motif there, a Latin motif. And then on the other side we have another image in crest and sign. So Gordon, tell me a little bit about maybe the ship in full sail.
Well, that's terribly relevant to the idea of merchandise and to what merchants were about, especially in royal boroughs or boroughs that were given charters that allowed them to trade, because in those days, how did you trade abroad? You traded in ships. Yes. And so both the merchants in Glasgow and the merchants in Edinburgh have part of their heraldic achievements a ship. And the one in Edinburgh flies Scottish flags. I can't see that we have particular flags on our one.
No, I don't.
And underneath that is the helm of an incorporation noble in the noblesse of Scotland, as the charter from the Lord Lion King of Arms has it. And then you have the globe subtended by the figure 4. And the figure 4 is in fact the astrological symbol for Mercury. And of course Mercury is the god of commerce.
I see. And I wonder why the 4, because, and we will look at the pew ends, but that 4 is really significant. I didn't realise that it had to do with Mercury. I didn't know that. And then we have this kind of totus idem. What does it refer to?
That really is an idea that you always come back to the same again. So it's you're spreading your bread upon the water, but it's coming back to you.
Do you know what I think is a lovely added edge to this is, if you were to journey from the cathedral here, travel south, and then take a kind of sharp easterly turn into the necropolis, which again has wonderful links with the merchants, because they originally had that fur park space they commission for a cemetery to be created. The commission is won, and then the cemetery evolves and becomes really quite a landmark in the city of Glasgow, that necropolis. However, the gates that allow you to go over the Bridge of Sighs, of which Turner has got a lovely portrait of the Bridge of Sighs. Yeah, it's interesting, from inside the necropolis, lovely. But if you look at those gates, they were gifted by the Lord Dean of Guild, and they have the same motif. Now, if that motif, in a sense, means returning to the same place again, how significant is that for returning to a cemetery? Maybe not as optimistic as your merchant ship sailing up the Clyde, but there is that sense in which we will all return to the same place again. We know that the merchants, especially in Glasgow, they've been doing a lot of work over the past few years upon recognising the enslaved peoples and what that brought to the city, and perhaps in a sense the legacy that's there from those engagements and activities. And I know that they've kind of redeveloped some spaces, and they've tried to recognise some of that work that they've done, as has Glasgow University, who have been award winners in trying to do these things. I was recently at the Merchants for it was the Lord Dean of Guild's valedictory dinner, and we had the chap who'd been working on the Dundas Monument in Edinburgh, and he did leave with us that sense in which we can't necessarily do anything about the past, but we can do something about the consequences of the past. And I think that comes through again and again when I see people grappling with these issues today in the city of Glasgow. But that's the Merchants window. On the other side, I'm seeing another crest there again. It looks like a kind of almost like a Masons and the Mungos and do you see the tools again of that we spoke of earlier, and then the ship again in full sail?
I think that will be the heraldic device of the Dean of Guild Court, which again was one of the things set up under the Letter of Gildry. And in I suppose up until the 1970s reform of local government, planning matters were the purview of the Dean of Guild Court. And it was staffed by what were called liners, or people who were skilled in the arts of building. And they tended to be drawn, two from the incorporation of Masons and two from the incorporation of Wrights.
So that would symbolise both of these trades.
So both these trades are in there, and there's the ship representing the merchants, and then on the top right you can see there is the arms of the Masons, and beneath them the arms of the Wrights, and the tools that one would employ in construction.
Yeah, very good. So again, a window that in and of itself tells us quite a significant story, not only of the past but the present in the city of Glasgow. I know. Gordon, let's go. We'll have a look at the carpet. On the chancel.
It's a wonderful carpet.
Yeah. I think what's fascinating, Gordon, is you don't really need to travel far to suddenly be engaging with different images. And if we're talking about an artistic approach, different medium. So, we'll talk about the glass, and the glass is important. And one piece of glass that really, in some senses, takes folks' breath away when they come in, even the kind of Great West door, they can see these 4 Lancet windows at the east end of the cathedral. And the east would always have been seen as the most holy place, the place where the sun rises and the new day begins and life is found. But at this end, above the chancel, we have these 4 Lancet windows. And what's fascinating is they point the viewer towards the significance of the building, the space, and why we're here. We're here to hear and listen to the Gospels. So if we look to the left Lancet, we have Matthew's Gospel depicted by the man. And then if we come in and we go to Matthew, Mark, we have the winged lion, which becomes significant. And then if we come over again to the third from the left, we have the calf, which is representative of Luke's Gospel. And then if we come over to the extreme right, we have the eagle, which is representative of John's Gospel. But the lovely thing here in the cathedral is we would know that historically it would not have been uncommon for these images to be laid in front of the lectern from which the Gospel was being read. So the person in the pew would know, oh well, there's the winged lion, it's Mark's Gospel today. But the interesting thing is, over time, as the leading lection becomes John's Gospel, the eagle becomes significant again and again. And very few of us will have been in churches that don't have some kind of eagle lectern of some shape or form. In the cathedral, we're very fortunate in that we have this gorgeous eagle lectern. It's actually 17th century, and it's from France.
Oh, how
So it's
that's where the idea actually originated, I believe.
I didn't know that. Is that right? Well, that's interesting. So this is 17th century, and it's French. And you know, it's so tactile, which is one of the dangers when you're in a kind of a cathedral like this, which has, in a good year, 600,000 visitors a year, because they all want to reach out and touch the feathers on this eagle.
It has that attraction about it.
It does. It does.
You do want to reach out and stroke the beast.
You do. And again, even the hook on the beak and such like. But again, just looking to the front end, if we would see it as such, we have these symbols of the Gospels. One piece of furniture here, which I find really quite significant, and probably only since coming as minister here have I realised its significance, because I now recognise that it's actually a piece of solid oak and it has a weightiness about it, and it's the cross. The cross that is mounted at the centre of the chancel here, because again, if you look at the 4 sections of the cross, each of them has the symbol of the gospel within it. So again, this solid piece of oak, beautifully crafted with different floral motifs, everything from sort of quadrifoils and trefoils and such like, but the 4 symbols of the gospel are represented on each of the arms of the cross. So anyone coming in a sense, knows what we're here for.
Absolutely.
We're here to listen to the gospel, Matthew, Mark, Luke and John, Matthew, Mark, Luke and John, and we'll hear it read from this significant lectern. So I really do, I find this chancel area significant by way of what we're here to do, to listen to the good news of Jesus Christ. So that's a significant for us. We then have the, Jesus Christ, the Saviour of men, the IHS, and the motif here. And then we have... Exactly, so the Saviour of men. And then we come across, we have the Alpha and the Omega, but we then have the fish, the bell, the tree, and the bird. And we know that these tie in with the miracles of Mungo. So he stimulates the hazel branch back to fire again, having been given the responsibility to look after it in the refectory, I think, that goes out.
Yes.
We have the bird, which I think some of his fellow students had managed to stone and bring down from the tree. The bell always intrigued me, because I have different stories about the bell. I think one comes that it was a gift, a papal bell that was to be rung to call people to worship. I don't know, any other thoughts on that?
I think that was just the traditional bell of the Celtic Church.
Yes. Is it a damson bell? I think there's such a thing as a damson bell.
Well, there could be. They weren't usually cast as one object in these days. They were often hammered together.
I see.
And I don't know what St Mungo's bell would have been like, but it certainly used to be rung in Glasgow on significant occasions.
Yeah.
And it would be, I don't know where it is now. I hope it has survived. It'd be interesting to know where these things have gone.
And the fish with the ring, we have the motif of the lady's honour being respected, because she gives the ring away to a knight and the husband requires the ring back, and she's in a dilemma and sent to the Clyde, I think, to fish out, either the Clyde or the Mollendiner, to fish out a salmon, to gut the salmon, and therein lies the ring. And her relationships with her husband are not quite as spurious as they maybe were had she not returned the ring. So, symbols of his miraculous endeavours in the city, and each of these symbols you will see throughout the city, whether it be in a bus stop or a lamppost or on the cover of a book, you'll see these symbols throughout the city, and they're throughout the church here. We have, over the past year, we've put a temporary installation, which is a neon sign, and it's by the artist James Pfaff. And we have a bit of a smile with some of our elders, because some of them think it's a piece of neon vandalism. But I think they say that tongue-in-cheek, because I think what they recognise is we're trying, in a sense, to have a relevant piece of contemporary art within the space. However, we had to take great care, because this pulpitium is one of the, I think it is the only in Scotland that is like this, and therefore we were very grateful to Historic Environment Scotland when we worked at how we were going to actually mount it and put it in place, and it took quite a bit of engineering know-how so as not to put any weight or potential disfigurement to the screen on the other side, where there is some of that ancient stone going back maybe 13th, 12th, 13th century stone. So it is a significant piece of work. in the life of the cathedral.
You mentioned earlier about the oak and that was used. I always think back to the oak trees that were sent by King Edward I to Bishop Wardlaw for the renovation of the cathedral, and the bishop diverted them to the Wars of Independence for the Scottish forces instead.
Well, do you know what the other interesting story with that is to do with Bishop Wishart?
Oh, yeah.
When Bishop Wishart's here and Robert the Bruce comes.
Oh, I've mistaken my bishop.
No, is that right? Is that right? Well, it was interesting because I think some money was given as well, and some of the money was then used for siege equipment in Kirkintilloch, because the common family castle was in Peel Park in Kirkintilloch. So he gave them some of the money, probably some of the timbers. They took them out to Peel Park in Kirkintilloch, and they laid siege to the common family castle. And if you remember, is it Blackfriars down in Dumfries where the stabbing takes place, and Robert the Bruce then seeks absolution from Bishop Wishart, who's in a sense maybe only too willing to give him it, and so history unfolds.
Yes,
but Gordon,
indeed.
this has been great to come in and come round with someone who knows quite a lot about the space and clearly has a great love of it, so thank you for that, really appreciate it.
I've much enjoyed my walk round with you.
Thank you.
I always learn from you.